Do you think when you make those choices, or I guess now there's three choices, there's one way, the other way, and holding
Wait,
off. Do you
correct.
think that uh, do you think there's any validity to the multiverse theory that, just any sentient being making a choice basically instantiates yet another universe? Or is that, I'm thinking of your geodesic dome, except that it
No, you're
looks
quite
more
correct.
hyperdimensional, so
Yeah,
that as many choices as there are in the system, there are dimensions in that hypergeodesic dome.
correct. Here's the problem with that in my way of thinking. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with the conceptually the idea of the multiverse is very attractive, and it is currently being noodled and chewed on by all the string theory guys. Okay, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a couple of problems with it that inevitably cannot be resolved, and so you're taking it on faith, and I don't like that. And here are the problems. If, as indeed we said, that every conscious being making every single conscious decision created a potential another timeline or multiverse, then what is coming up relative to the string theory is a thing called stacking. And that is the idea that even within a single lifetime, the decisions you would make would so stack multiverses that in a finitely bound universe, a single person's lifetime interacting with only those beings that are alive with them at that same time would inevitably, within a very short period of time, stack universe the materium so completely full that something would give and basically probably have to create what we would think of as a big bang. Now, this is determined because of the multiplicity of what's going on. Bear in mind that you and I and everybody we're talking with at the moment and everybody who's going to be listening to this is sharing our particular neck of the woods, aka planet Terra or Earth, with how many millions of species and how many millions of individuals within each species. We know there's 7 billion members of our own species, more or less. In fact, so many we can't accurately determine that. And that is the case with all other species. It is suspected that the largest number of species on the planet that we think of, insects, may actually be further or maybe less than that. They may be the second largest number of species, and fungi may actually have a greater level of DNA variance. If this is the case, then stacking would blow universe to smithereens, basically. Now, here's another issue with that. The multiverse guys are postulating that creationism, a kind of weird creationism, that every time you make a decision at the conscious mind level, that somehow a new timeline is created by that decision being made, kind of like It's a Wonderful Life, and or decides to commit suicide or help a guy and something like that, and events are all changed. This I believe to be the case. I understand this. I think this is the case, that you make a decision and things are changed thereafter. But I do not buy into the idea of alternate timelines or multiverse at that level. I do indeed think multiverse exists, but I don't think that we create them. I think that I'm on the what's known as the slicing theory side. There's a whole group of, I guess you'd have to say, contrarian thinkers that are saying string theory is a artifact of how we think about things, and that if we were to think about ourselves as vibrational beings, as vibrating standing waves of energy, then we will get a whole new concept of how universe operates, as opposed to thinking of ourselves as material beings in which things are strung together. So in other words, the whole string theory idea is the same idea of DNA. Watson and Crick discovered DNA. Well, what they actually saw was an energetic pattern that is expressing itself as a double helix. And the various amino acids all clumped together, and as we know, the whole structure. But at its core, it's really an energetic form that we are choosing at the moment to interpret as DNA. And these choices of the moment in terms of our interpretation alter our reality. I had a discussion here the other day with Kathy about this, and it's the idea of if you have no context in which to frame what you are viewing, you can't really decipher it, and it may take you a long time to build up a context as to what you're seeing. Now, we've had such excuses, such reasoning used to say that that's why the Polynesians were so in awe of Captain Cook when he showed up, was because that's why they didn't see Captain Cook as coming off of a ship. or a boat. They weren't really sure what they were seeing when they saw him show up in the big, large, ribbed, heavy timbered floating island. And that's because, and that's what the Westerners say, is that, oh, their Captain Cook's boat was so superior, it would be like us seeing a UFO and not really knowing what it is. Now, personally, I think I dispute that, because I think that Captain Cook and his boat, really it was a case of the Polynesians were saying, they sailed here in that junk, because these were people that were highly sophisticated in sailing and so on. So their context was greater than what we gave them credit for. But we have to acknowledge that if we're in a situation where our minds are being affected by debris from space, so to speak, energy and so on, that it all is going to get to be something of a crapshoot in the interpretation. And this, to a certain extent, I think opens us up to a whole new renaissance. And I think we're truly at a breakthrough point, and I think that's what March represents. Whether we will fall into the abyss of those limited number of minds that desperately wish us to go back to some kind of feudalism, because that's what they understand, or whether we will open ourselves up to the greater glory of what our species can actually become, we are all facing mere months from now. Unfortunately, we've got to wrap our heads around who we are and all of that kind of stuff just to participate with it.
Clif,
I'm sure I've gotten way off topic.
No, thank you so much. You've given me about 100 years worth of stuff to think about. I think we probably need to go ahead for other questions.
Sure.
Thank you, Herm. We're moving on to the linguistics questions. And Herm, your next question, please.
Clif, could you comment on the dramatic changes in the metadata pattern you relate to in the last shape report, as to your thought that new language foretells fundamental change? And I guess just to develop the question just a tad more, in Celtic language, Old Celtic, name and soul were closely related. Of course, the belief that before you could control something, one can name it. Of course, with the discussion we just had, when we name something, it just appears. But in any case, if that is true, does the you had mentioned that there was an increasing awareness of the control of language by the old order, and it's sort of becoming more disseminated. And the naming of new concepts and constructs as they relate to the old order, and those concepts and constructs that relate to the coming order, whatever it might be. And does this contribute to the emotional tension values that you mentioned were bubbling up through the metadata levels?
That actually is the actual driving force for the tension values, both building and release. What you're describing to a certain extent is, look at it as from a linguist point of view. Language is the function of the young. So even now there's 3-year-olds that are trying to invent new words because they don't think their mama's experience really describes those words, and they don't like your mama's words. So that's happening continuously. The real problem of the elite at the moment is that they have unwittingly unleashed the internet, which allows this language creation thing to get all out of hand. The way they control us is by controlling and framing the language. Without the spin doctors, without the mainstream media, we would not be where we are now. Without the control of language since the 1800s, we would not be where we are now. We would be an entirely different planet and an entirely different species. So, and basically, the coming disorder is how I think of it, with a big D and a big O in there, is that the coming disorder represents the breakout of linguistics, where we no longer allow our thoughts to be framed by language controlled by the, if you will, the parental organizations, big pharma, big religion, big government, big military, and that we all break out as a species and decide that we're all going to be sovereign adults. Now, as a secondary thing, getting back to your idea of the Celtic name and soul thing, let me point out 2 separate traditions. One here on the West Coast, which is the Salish culture, going up into the Tlingit and all the way down into California to the various indigenous tribes, have a replicational cultural tradition that actually matches cultures in the Kashmir and northern India area. Both of these cultures independently have the same concept that the Celts do relative to name and soul, and maybe the Celts are as evolved in this. I don't know. I only know these two, but the Salish and the Tinglet here have this idea of the three names. You have the name that you are born with, your vibrational name that only you can hear, and that is the sound that your name, your vibrational name, is basically your vibrational state when all other noise to your ears are extinguished. That noise that you hear, that high-pitched hum, if you will, that particular frequency, that's your name. That is you as a standing wave hearing yourself. So that's your universe name. Now, the Hindus also have this concept of the universe name, your universe sound, and from which we also get all the om and all the mantras and this kind of thing, the chants. We also note that the Salish and especially the rowers use the same chanting stuff to get the energy synchronized and develop internal ki and so on. Now, the second name you have is that name that you are willing to say to yourself, and it's a word that you use to describe yourself. And these are your two simple names, and then you have your complex names, which are your deceptive names or your raven names, and those are the names and the labels that we give to the rest of the world. Now, in the Salish, their tradition is not so dark as is the Hindu tradition, which goes to the Sanskrit, which goes to a great deal more history. The Hindu tradition would have your secret names be held secret and your deceptive name be out there, because people can use your names, that is to say, the vibration at which you vibrate, your frequency construct, against you. And of course, we know that entrainment exists in reality. I can take two old-style pendulum clocks, not involved with digital mechanisms, but are on our standard pendulum, set one going at one rate and set it on a wall, and then 5 minutes later set another clock with a different rate on that same wall, and they will entrain together. I can also do this experiment with other angles and planes and get those clocks to entrain. This also happens with neuro-linguistic programming. This is the whole point of spin doctors, to get all these minds entrained on the, what do they call them? What are their word list? Talking points. They want everybody to memorize talking points and only talk about the talking points and only repeat these vibrations. And this goes all the way back to John Dee, who was the original 007 secret spy for the Merovingian bloodline, which is the Windsors et al., the Queen of England and all of them. And they were of the opinion, even in the 1500s, that entrainment at a vibrational level could be used to control humans, and a good deal of the black arts of alchemy were used towards that effect. And so the naming issue and the soul issue is really key, as well as all the vibrational and so on. And it's also entwined with linguistics, that you cannot separate them. You start looking at one level of this and examining, why is that word here? And why do we have these, that dreaded Y word? What was the intent there? And you find out that certain words are indeed part of people's agenda. And then, of course, it becomes relatively easy, if one is a linguist, to use their own tools against them. And that's what we're all doing now with the internet. It's no longer simply the toolbox that linguists use. We're all inventing new words, and we're keeping them out of the hands of the powers that be. And let me point out one thing there, a feeling that everybody can relate to, I think. You're sitting there, you're a teenager. A lot of us, we have to think way back to when it was like to be a teenager or a young adult. But imagine you're sitting there and you come across, maybe you're traveling and you're seeing TV, or you're at your parents' house and they've got one of the news stations on, and you see one of these old fart newscasters that are in their baby boom years use modern or semi-current slang. And by semi-current, the media is usually about 3 to 5 years behind. So they will use a word that is about 3 to 5 years out of date, thinking it is current. You will get a feeling that will start at the back of your neck and go down through your shoulder blades as you just basically mentally cringe